Mazel tov to Terrence Hayes. Turn another page.
The last two presentations would have made great final presentations. Books honored with a prize that's awarded each year, a prize restricted to only those books that are published in the previous year, are at least in part honored for being new. So, like Jim, I've realized that they tell us something about their moment. Yet when I think of a legacy, I think of something enduring, of course, something worth handing down from generation to generation, with its meaning renewed and changed by changing circumstances. So when I received the list of 61 years of winning volumes from the National Book Award, I carried it over to my poetry bookshelves to see which books were in the most ragged condition from years of engaged reading, which were, as Maureen just said, news that stayed news. This was certainly one of them, even as they physically fell apart. So in the end, I took 4 of these prize winners in hand: Stephen's Auroras of Autumn, Auden's Shield of Achilles, Ashbury's Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror, and Ammons' Garbage. These 4 books continue to resist and expand my view of the world and my own habits of form. I can't say anything, of course, conclusive about them tonight, but I'd like to talk a bit about how they present not only new means of making individual poems, but also new ways of putting together a book as itself a work of art. Written in the years immediately after World War II, when Wallace Stevens had felt some torment about the role of the poet in wartime, The Auroras of Autumn opens with the poet's address to the Northern Lights, and from there forward, the 32-poem sequence is a sustained consideration of light and color. Stevens reveals how these unembodied forms, transformed by metaphor, help us create the mist that makes sense of our world. The heavens, the hells, the worlds, the longed-for lands, as he writes in An Ordinary Evening in New Haven. These poems are elaborately connected to one another by changes in scale, with the world as the central poem, the essential poem that begets all others. And in this book, we find some of Stevens' own most essential poems, including The Owl in the Sarcophagus, his magisterial elegy to his friend Henry Church. With sparkling effect, the book is stitched together by repeated glimpses of a certain creek and a certain river, the Black Swatara and the Green Schuylkill. The 28 poems of Auden's Shield of Achilles from 1955 are also haunted by war and the figure of the poet as a propagandist. Auden uses the tripartite structure of his book to present 3 different ways of viewing the continuing struggle between Arcadian and utopian values: the spaces of the bucolic, the dialectic of history, the sacred order of ritual. Perspective views multiply constantly in this book. It's part Chinese box and part labyrinth. Through it all turns the water wheel that drives the forge, where weapons are created by the smithy Hephaestus, the half-god, half-man, maker of masterpieces, who prefigures the descent of Christ. Auden renders all this complexity of backdrop, backstory, and other openings onto time in the most clear diction and resonant sound. I literally can't get over it. Ashbury uses the title poem of his 1975 Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror to structure and anchor the book as a whole, so we find ourselves at first following a series of sketches, briefer and lighter poems that sometimes thread themselves into versions. He plays with pronouns, forms of address, syntax, and stanza forms in these pieces until we arrive at the 552 blank verse lines of the closing poem with its considered and often anguished voice. His self-portrait takes off from a lived encounter with Parmigianino's famous work, but where Parmigianino explored the limits of perspective through his anamorphic experiment in realism, Ashbury explores the invisible, what is lost to time and history. In the end, he lineates, glimpses from the equally distorting perspectives of memory and imagination, an impossible portrait of the soul. And Ammons' Garbage from 1993 is one long sequence in 18 sections of blank verse meditations on the possibilities for representing motion, which is a project I think he took from Dante, obviously. He calls them shapes on the move, and they vary from a rabbit's leap to the changing forms of anxiety and love. Also a late work full of dark humor and a wise commentary on the difficulty of wisdom, Garbage is one of the best examples I know of how the thinking that goes on in poetry is more capacious than the thinking that goes on anywhere else. Thank you.
Point for a poet and an apogee for culture. Tony, the cultural moment and the poetic moment, sometimes what's more important is the cultural moment. Maureen, nostalgia is gross. Susan, the kind of thinking that happens in poetry is the most capacious kind. But I thought the best way to start would be to see whether you had any questions for each other after hearing each other speak. If you don't, I have a question for you. And since you're my captive audience, maybe I'll start by asking it. One of the things that as a young poet seems to me, the obvious thing I want to know is where this leaves me, right? What my lineage is. But that's not the question I want to ask you. What I want to ask is about the seemingly dead letters in this list of books from the National Book Award, the poets and the books that it seems that we don't read anymore. And I was thinking about it because this terrific blog that the National Book Foundation has put together has a number of great essays by young poets of color who are talking about some of these early poets. They're on the blog, so I encourage you to read them. And their feelings about some of these poets are quite lukewarm. So there's no reason to address any of these poets specifically, but I'm wondering about the things that American poetry has lost that are maybe we've lost for good reason. Just as a culture, maybe we want to leave behind.
Most poetry will be lost.
Yeah.
The vast majority of poetry that is written will be lost. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but unless something changes, unless suddenly, poetry occupies a space of cultural prominence that it has hitherto never, ever in the history of time occupied.
But that wouldn't help. But that wouldn't help. What art form has the most cultural prominence right now? Film. Most films are lost. Most films are never seen.
Good point.
I don't know. I interrupted you.
You usually do.
Usually?
I was done. I was just playing.
I feel I've been played with. I don't like attacking things usually, although sometimes it's very good that someone attack. I do like defending things, and I found myself disagreeing with Jim, not when he said that most poets will be forgotten, because they will, not when he said that 100 years from now, if we're around and not underwater and reading poems in English at all, we might read in depth only 8 to 10 20th century poets. That could be right. But it seems to me that it is our job, not as poets, young or otherwise, but as readers and certainly as critics, to figure out what else is out there that is in danger of being lost, and perhaps to make a case for it. And that's what we do with the 19th century too. In fact, Jim, it's what you have been known to do on occasion. And one of the fun things about events
Can I interrupt
like
you
this,
now? Because I want to say that I don't. You think you're disagreeing with me, but you're not. I think all of that work is of value. I think for there to be any great poetry at all, there must be thousands of little Richard Aldingtons and Lionel Johnsons running around doing a lot of that kind of work, creating the space for which the possibility of greatness might occur. But I guess what I'm resisting is the notion that we can actually congratulate ourselves for making it happen, and that we can think that we will know, and that we can congratulate ourselves for having taste.
I don't think that's the point of the NBA or or us as readers. And, when you say most poetry will be lost and most poets will be lost, I just don't care in a way. What I care is that we find it now. I'm going to call you from now on, Jim. I'm going to call you Ecclesiastes Longenbach. It's kind of a, it's so satisfying to be Ecclesiastes and say, all this is a blink of an eye, and do you hear the dust storm howling around us? But in fact, what matters is that we find it, and that it continue to vitalize us, and that we continue to vitalize it. And what matters is that we are lost now, and that's why we all came to poetry. We came to poetry, or I forgot. I'm not supposed to speak for everybody. That's why I came to poetry, and that's why I think people who are passionate about it do come to it. And so it's really important, and it's really important that out of our lostness, or out of their lostness, poets be making the thing that we need, that says, that either confirms our feeling, yes, I'm lost too, or this is why we're lost, or this is what we have to do, or something more esoteric than that. But nonetheless, the center, the location is in our lostness, and that's where our vitality and our remaking. And so, even more, culture is disposable. Our memories are shorter and shorter, and things move faster and faster. Fuck it. But it doesn't mean there isn't good poetry and not so good poetry.
But is culture more important to poetry than it used to be, or has our relationship to culture changed? I mean, that's the question I had after your remarks as well, not just in terms of the composition of it, but just in terms of the way we relate to it, not just because of things like the internet as the possibility for national representation by a book award. Has that also changed? Even if it doesn't change the way people write, will it change the way people read and the way people recover things?
Could you say again what you mean, or could you say more about what you mean is culture?
Has culture changed? Is culture the same as it was we talked about in the 50s? There was more of a consensus in some sense about what was a great book of some kind. There's less consensus now. Is that not just because of poetry, but it's also because culture is really different?
Culture has changed, and it's harder and harder for poetry, to find where it needs to be and to find us in culture. It's all so blurry now. Go ahead, Stephen.
Fine. There are more people. There are more books, there are more readers, there are more writers, there are more people in America, there are more publishers, there are more little magazines, there are more sets of ways of thinking about culture and poetry, whatever culture means, and there are a number of good books about how many different things the word culture can mean. But the 50s are not a time of consensus. They may have been a time of consensus among the people giving out this award in the 50s, and my top 5 books of the 50s are probably on this list. But my next 5 are not, and there's a whole set of people who were writing in the 50s who are maybe more influential today than, say, Conrad Aiken, who would have wanted Creeley and Olson, and I believe Duncan, you mentioned Duncan on this list, and Jack Spicer, who I have very mixed feelings about, but who a lot of people think is important. And several of you mentioned that Gwendolyn Brooks isn't on this list. This is the 50s are not a time of consensus. There are no times of consensus. There are times of greater or lesser numbers of sets of beliefs that writers can share. There are times when there seem to be 3 schools and times when there seem to be 20, out of which one great poet may or may not emerge. But I don't think that there has ever been in American letters a time when everybody we read now more or less agreed. Sorry to jump on you, Katie.
And I think sometimes I imagine that there have been the same numbers of people writing poems across the decades in the last few hundred years, perhaps. I mean, we can't know exactly. But I do think what has changed, and this is why I'm interested in the way that value is assigned and appropriated, the institutions where